Okay, everyone, I want to welcome you to Magnolia United Church of Christ monthly learning forum. We've been doing this once a month over the past year, and we've had a really wide variety of topics, and are just so honored tonight to welcome back to the MUCC community, Dr. Cheryl Cook, who I unbiasedly say is one of my all-time favorite people in the whole wide world and possibly the smartest person I've ever met. And last year, Dr. Cook accompanied us in some of our anti-racist work. And we asked her to come back this year to talk about a topic that is really in the news a lot right now, which is critical race theory, and help us understand what it is and what it isn't. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cook. She's going to speak for about a half hour to 40 minutes and allow time for questions. Please feel free to use the chat function if you have questions while she's speaking. I'll keep an eye on chat and interrupt her with questions, or you can hold it till the end and we'll have time for questions there. And just as an FYI, we are recording this. We had lots of requests for people to hear this afterwards. So this session is being recorded. So with that being said, I will turn it over to the smartest person I know, Dr. Cheryl Cook.
I'm a little concerned, Marcy, that you don't know a lot more smart people. I suspect you do. I'm Cheryl Cook. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here tonight. And it's my pleasure to meet with you all and speak with you on this kind of important topic right now. One of the things I wanted to ask folks just briefly, and maybe Marcy, if you can allow people to unmute for a moment. What have you heard about critical race theory and what are your worries?
And I did go ahead and mute everybody, so feel free to unmute yourself if you want to answer Dr. Cook's question.
This is Bev.
Hi, Bev.
And hi, thank you for being here tonight. My concern is, I think, that they aren't, that the schools are having all this conversation about critical race theory, and so many places don't seem to want to include it in the curriculum. So that is a concern for me.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll talk about that a little bit. Anyone else? Have you heard anything or had concerns about anything? If not, it's okay.
I got one.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, my name's Alex. I've heard a lot about it, a lot of pushback around it. And my biggest concern is that people don't read the book closely enough, like how to be an anti-racism or how to be an anti-racist, like about critical race theory, because I think it was like what, page 19, he says the what was it? The only cure for past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only cure for present discrimination is future discrimination on the basis of race. And he's not talking about other people's ideas, it's what he thinks needs to be done, which is, I thought the point was to end racism, not to keep adding more to the pile.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's you've brought up something that makes a lot of sense and people have a lot of worries about. So we'll talk about what critical race theory is, and we'll talk a little bit about what it isn't. Because I think what most people are struggling with are stories about, are concerns about things that are not necessarily what critical race theory is. So my interest in it comes from about, I hate to say it, almost 25 years ago when I was a master's student and a doctoral student at the University of Washington. I am currently a nurse practitioner. In my past, I have been a college professor in the College of Nursing, in several colleges of nursing, UW, the Bothell campus. I've was a postdoc at the Seattle campus. I also taught at Arizona State University in their College of Nursing and at Seattle U as well, which was my most recent job. Most of my research has been around people of color, particularly men who are leaving prison, and African-American men in particular. And part of my interest and my experience of getting introduced to critical race theory happened when I was doing my PhD, when I was looking at a series of theories to help explain what happened to African-American men when they ended up in prison. How did they see themselves as men, and how do you get them back into the community in ways that are meaningful? So that's when I read critical race theory. It was really important for me to see that in terms of, in light of what I was studying. I also am always interested in racial issues, including race, gender, disability issues related to my own life and my own experience as an African-American woman in the US. Part of that experience is always and often being the only one or one of a few. At UW, at the University of Washington in my PhD program, I was the 6th Black woman to graduate from their PhD program, their doctorate in nursing science program. The program's been going since 1978. And I believe about now there's only been about 14 of us who are, who identify as African-American who've been through that program. I had often been the only kid in my class who was African-American. When I went to boarding school for high school, I was one of 4 African-American girls at a school of almost 300 kids. I can walk into a party pretty much anywhere in Seattle and be the only African-American person. And so, and with that comes a lot of experience in people asking me about race, asking me to speak for my own, to speak for all African-Americans, sometimes without intentionally, realizing that they're asking that. Identifying me as, well, you're not that type of African-American person, or you don't sound African-American, or you must be mixed with something, and not assuming that I have an experience as an African-American person that includes racism and oppression here in the US. So that's why thinking about ways that we work backwards or work toward ending systematic racism in this country matter to me. I experience it on a level that goes in with my job as a college professor, where I would kind of hit the ceiling, or what people saw as a ceiling for a Black woman, associate professor. And all of a sudden, I was somebody who had more education than anyone in my department. And the people in my department couldn't think of anything more for me to do but to teach the same courses I've been teaching for 10 years. That's when I kind of really grew frustrated with academia and walked away from it, because no matter how much education I had, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I could be seen as a Black woman, and my job was to teach. And because I was a good teacher, I could teach anything, but I couldn't be seen as somebody who could move up in the profession. And in nursing, that issue is rampant. In nursing, most administrators in nursing are white, and many of the line staff, including RNs, many LPNs, and almost all folks who are working at the nursing assistant level are people of color. So at some point you wonder, why are we never put into leadership positions still in this year, 2022? As I mentioned, my research is with incarcerated men and their families. I also did some research around parental coaching for multi-ethnic families, as well as my current job, which is to work as a psych nurse practitioner. So I see lots of people of color in my practice, which I have to say is something that I'm delighted to do. It tells me that people of color are now looking out for their own mental health, something that I, as a younger person, it was never even a consideration in my family of origin. So it really makes me excited to be thinking about ways that we can reduce racism in health systems, in mental health care, for which we have a very long history of enacting systematic racism in these areas. I'm gonna hit oh, there we go. Okay, so what's the history of critical race theory? Well, critical race theory was developed at Harvard Law School in response to a lack of diversity in faculty and in the student body. And as I spoke about, that isn't just my experience. That's something that goes on all around the country in academia, where we see people of color somehow, despite them getting world-class educations, being stopped becoming the only faculty of color in their department. In my department, I was the only African-American. There was a woman who was of African descent, who was also a professor, but she came in after I did. And that was not an unusual thing. In the College of Nursing in Seattle, at the same time, I believe there were 2 African-American faculty members there. And at Seattle U, I believe there were 2 there. If you think about faculties, particularly in the colleges of nursing, where there are 300 and 400 faculty members, to have 2 African-American faculty is a problem. Because if we have a lot of different students and we're really recruiting students from many ethnic backgrounds, we really want students to see and learn from people who look like them so that we can grow that population of educators. If we have a paltry number of people available, it really doesn't make that dream ever come true. So at Harvard, they saw this happening in their school. And they started to think about, what caused this? What was going on that kept this in place? So what they developed was thinking around, the professor's name is Dr. Derek Bell, and he argues that, former cultural competence, which is what we mostly talk about. We want people to be culturally competent or able to interact with people who are different than them. But these policies really didn't ensure that there would be equality in how systems worked, how people got into schools, how people got jobs, or how people moved up in the ranks. And in fact, just thinking that we are doing things in a culturally competent way sometimes covered up the fact that despite that behavior, there was substantial inequality. And an example was like if schools were colorblind, and by extension, the field of law and government itself were colorblind, why did we still continue to see so many disparities, both in who got into law school, who were faculty, who were students, as well as disparities in the law, where we have mostly people of color in prison in disproportionate numbers to their percentage of the population. So if you have 80% of the population are white folks, you would expect that 80% of the people who go to prison would be white. But currently that's not the case. African Americans make up 13% of the population and often are 1/3 the number of people who are in prison. So why does that disparity exist? This theory was used to help understand this situation. And then we also, when we think about critical race theory, we're thinking about how do we look at current manifestations of group advantages and disadvantages, both in our history as a country and in our current social practices, such as hiring, such as home ownership, such as, or giving loans out to get whole homes, such as enacting the things like the GI Bill. Why do we still see disparities there, and who's benefiting and who's disadvantaged in those systems? So CRT was a set of theories that was used to start looking at these questions. And now critical race theory is not only used as a legal set of theories to uncover and look at policies that create disadvantage, but it also is being looked at in the educational arena. It's also being looked at in social work. I used it in my work in nursing, and many other nurses and nurse theorists use this theory to help them understand problems around healthcare. So when we talk about critical race theory, it's not this thing over here. It is the idea of an action. It's this taking action to question ideas and social structures that will reinforce inequality. And that's what we use critical race theory for. We're trying to think of it not as a series of things that harm, but a way of thinking that can expand. So I covered a little bit of this, but this were some of the tenets from Dr. Bell, which was the idea that racism is an endemic and permanent aspect of the experience that people of color have in our society. It doesn't really matter who these people are. And if people are telling you, I'm not, people of color are saying, oh, I don't ever experience racism, I would say that they are not really in tune to their experience in the world, because you can't escape it here in the US. And it is not just here in the US, it is worldwide. Recently, there have been stories about people leaving the Ukraine, and some of those people being of African descent, and yet not being allowed into places like Poland, because we've got to let Ukrainians in first. This idea that you can't be Ukrainian and African. Another aspect of critical race theory is this idea that if we can find a way where interests converge with one another, where people who are in power can find a reason and can find interests that will help and will make lives better for both themselves and people of color in different areas, we can work on this piece around racism. We can help there be, or rather we can work on the piece around inequality. But you really kind of have to have the idea of both, it's going to benefit the people in power and it will help the people who are struggling. And then finally, when we think of critical race theory, this idea of intersectionality is huge. So it's not just thinking and looking at people based on their race. It's understanding that there are multiple places where people can be harmed or people can experience oppression. So because people have what we call subordinate identities, such as gender, religion, class, sexual orientation, and there's all kinds of forms of oppression that they experience on top of racism. And all of those influence the way that people of color live their lives. So you can be a Latino woman who is also a lesbian, who also is Catholic, and then experiencing racism, also experiencing gender discrimination, and may also be discriminated against because of her religion. So we're not just one thing, and none of us are just one thing. We are multiple beings. We share multiple or intersectional identities, and all of those identities are subject to being harmed because of inequality. So here's some things I want you to think about that, oops, let me go back, that critical race theory isn't. And I have to move my, a bit of the technology here so I can actually see. Well, one of the things it isn't is cultural competence. And yet you often hear people arguing that we don't want to have to be culturally competent, or we don't have to always pay attention. We don't want to have to always pay attention to having schools teach our children how to be, what's the phrase that they use all the time? It's not culturally competent, but they use a different phrase. Sensitive, sometimes they use that term, or I see, and this is how unsteeped in that language I am, that I can't remember the term that gets used all the time. And it's kind of a derogatory term to talk about how we don't want to have to be told what to do. A lot of times people will say, well, that's only woke people are interested in cultural competence. And we don't need you to be in, I don't want to be woke. I don't have to be woke. Well, it's not just being woke. It's actually thinking about, what harms and what helps groups of people. Cultural critical race theory isn't anti-racist teaching. So it's not going into the classroom and teaching your child how not to be an anti-racist. It's not making sure that the US history is accurately taught, although that's something that can help and can be useful, and a useful tool in understanding things from a critical race theoretical perspective. It's not teaching for social justice, and it's not diversity or equity or inclusion in jobs. It is a theory, and it is a theory for analyzing problems. It's not going to make Juneteenth a federal holiday, and it's not Marxism. I would argue that we're all Marxists because we all have lived and learned to live in a society following that was built around Marxism. It's not teaching people to hate the US, and it's not teaching children to hate the US. And most importantly, it's not being taught by K through 12 students to K through 12 students. It's not being taught in elementary school. Critical race theory is a analysis tool that we use, and we're not teaching it and using it with K through 12 students to help analyze racial or inequality situations. So when you hear people kind of making noise about these kinds of things, that's not what critical race theory is. So why do we teach it at the college level? A lot of times we teach critical race theory to help students be able to tease through what are larger systems or institutions doing that may oppress certain groups, and how might that oppression impact the lives of people of color or others in the US, gendered minorities. How does that, who also may be people of color. So we teach it at the college level so that students can take policy that they might be learning and analyze that policy, kind of tease the policy apart and look at what works and what doesn't work. We really find it useful in the following professions, in the legal field. So critical race theory was used to look at things like incarceration rates and why certain people ended up in prison and why people didn't. We use it in education when we're teaching about education. We use it in engineering, and when we're looking at the built environment, when we're looking at where factories are placed, or where what is it called? Like oil refineries are placed. Is that something, or are these placed only in communities of color, or are they placed in other communities? And what's the impact of placing a factory or a refinery in a certain area? We want to tease apart the policy that leads us to those places. There's a big conversation right now about about should there be a juvenile prison placed in the greater Seattle area. Well, you know, nobody's looking to place that in Magnolia, but they often are looking to place these undesirable things in communities of color or low-income communities. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why does it happen there? In healthcare, we use critical race theory a lot to think about outcomes. Are there reasons that are related to inequality that people are having worse outcomes than other groups, that African Americans have, African American women have higher rates of maternal mortality than do white women? What's contributing to that? And some of the news is that racism itself is contributing to that. We look at public policy, and we also look at the natural sciences. And why do we look at the natural sciences and think about critical race theory in terms of natural sciences? Well, some of the reasons that we look at it is because we make assumptions about certain ideas, such as the assumption around race, that there was for years an assumption that race was a biological process. And what we know now, because of genetics, is that race is not biological. Race is a social construction. It is an idea that has been developed by society itself, not based on what people's biology looks like. If you compared our biology from a genetic perspective, across race, we are 99.999 the same, regardless of what we look like. In fact, there's more diversity between myself and other Africans than there are between myself and white people. And so we use critical race theory to answer some of those questions. And then we also are using it to understand what's the utility of this in everyday life. Well, if we teach students to make these types of analyses of structures, of institutions, of policy, then eventually students learn to acknowledge the problems and address issues around that are often racist policies, or issues around intersectionality where people are being harmed, in order to work to find interest in which, or areas where we're allied, and then work to change and eliminate inequality. And that's something that improves everyone's life. So where does the noise come from? Well, this is part of the noise machine here. I think some of this is a very political thing. People hear words and they sound scary, and so they use scary words. Now, if you look at this, I loved this picture just because it screams at you that you should be afraid. That critical race theory is, and I got this from an article that was talking about how Tucker Carlson didn't even know what critical race theory is. He says, to be honest, after almost a year of talking about it. But he's got kind of this blast of, well, this is anti-white mania, and that lunatics are running the classrooms. Lunatics aren't running the classrooms, and there isn't really anti-white mania. We are just questioning. We have, I think, finally, people of color have been able to become educated enough in the society and have risen to such positions where they're able to begin questioning, why are certain policies in place? Why aren't we thinking about this from a larger perspective? So unlike what Tucker thinks, critical race theory critiques how the social construction of race, or the way we think about groups, and how institutional racism perpetuate a racial caste system that relegates some people, in particular people of color, to the bottom tiers of society. That's what critical race theory is doing. We use it to critique our current systems that are in place that prevent inequality. and relegate one group to an upper tier and other groups to lower tiers. So all the noise that you hear, that entire list that people are coming into your child's classroom to brainwash them into hating white people, that's insane. And frankly, it's this sort of scare tactic to get people to be fighting against one another. So one of the articles I looked at, which I loved, I really wanted to talk about why it's really important that we have a kind of give accurate education to children. So this is from the Washington Post article called Teaching America's Truth. And I quoted it directly from there. For generations, children have been spared the whole terrible reality about slavery's place in the American history. But some schools are beginning to strip away the deception and evasions. And so when you hear people screaming from Fox News and other sources about they don't want critical race theory in the classroom, we know that critical race theory now isn't in the classrooms, but what is in the classrooms are people talking about race in open ways. Teachers are now talking and leading students through understanding difficult parts of our history here in the US. And this is what people are afraid of. This is what they're calling critical race theory, because it's critical of US history. And it should be critical of US history. The US has done some things that are really problematic. And slavery is only one of them. You know, if we look at indigenous populations, coming to the country and taking the land of Native Americans, and unfortunately bringing with them illnesses that killed off large swaths of the population, or having them march out of their own homelands and killing off another large swath of the population to displace them so that somebody else could take their land. That's a problem, and that history needs to be told, because we can't understand why Native Americans are struggling unless we look back at that history and we look at it honestly. And there are schools now who are doing this. And this was the introduction to this article. And it's out of the Washington Post, Teaching America's Truth. Pacing his classroom in North Central Iowa, Tim McClellan prepared to deliver an essential truth about American history to his 8th grade students. He stopped and slowly turned and raised his index finger in front of his chest. Think about this. For 246 years, slavery was legal in America. It wasn't made illegal until 154 years ago. The 26-year-old teacher told his 23 students sitting before him at the Fort Dodge Middle School. So what does that mean? It means that slavery has been a part of America much longer than it has not been a part of America. Now, that is just a very basic objective fact. And I would think that most parents would want their children to understand this very objective fact that if you count up the years from when Africans were first brought to this country, people were in slavery longer than they haven't been in slavery. And if we think about this 154 years, we can also remember that many of those years were issues with Jim Crow laws in the South and in other places in the US. So African Americans as a population have been oppressed for a very long time. And part of this article talked about children learn where the ideas of unequal treatment come from and how and why the US society struggles to let this thinking and behavior go. And I was really impressed with the idea that, here's a school in the Midwest trying very hard and actually in a rural area, trying very hard to deliver an accurate portrayal of American history to their students. Now, the really interesting part of this was, and I don't have this slide in, there was a little girl who talked about why, if you go to the article, you can see her talk about why it's important for her to have learned this information. So this is a question I often get, which is, what are people of color complaining about? And it often gets said to me in that phrase, what are you guys complaining about? And I would just sum it up with, we're complaining about a lack of acknowledgement and a lack of change in behavior. That after 246 years of slavery and another 154 years without slavery, we still are suffering from unequal treatment. And you can see this by the headlines. You know, Native Americans feel invisible in the US healthcare system. And they do. And this was on NPR. If you look at these two pictures, these are both pictures of slavery, believe it or not. This was a picture many years ago when we had active slavery. This is a picture from 2011. And this picture is at Angola, a prison in Louisiana. So, you know, we still have forms of slavery here in the US, and most when that slavery is happening and those places that slavery is happening, people of color are involved in it. They are the people who are the slaves. So what are we asking for? What are we complaining about? We're complaining about the fact that more and more here in the US, people are ignoring the entire history of slavery. They don't even want to hear about it now, which is all the screaming that you hear from Fox News and parents showing up at meetings. They're screaming because they don't want their children hearing a story from the US, a way that people lived for many years. And they certainly don't want these aspects of slavery being taught. And so they're in the room screaming at teachers about this. This is what happened in slavery. Families were separated, and we can absolutely say families were still separated again 3 years ago. We were still separating families. We still have modern slavery in US prisons where prisoners make 3 cents an hour, putting desks together for Saunders. But we can't just keep ignoring these things and expect there to be some level of equity in the country. We're complaining about people ignoring the long-term effects of colonialism. When people came to our country as colonists, they took land and they took resources, and we still go into countries and steal land and steal resources. Indigenous people were killed and still are killed worldwide. One of the things we're complaining about is that even as we speak of things, even as we do impressive research like the 1619 Project, nobody wants to hear about it. You know, this became Trump's favorite target, to yell about the 1619 Project. I don't think the man ever listened to it. It was fantastic, though, if you've never listened to the podcast on this. The stories are breathtaking. We currently do this by ignoring people of color who are creators, by pushing white creators. We see this on social media all the time. By the way, algorithms push certain people in an unequal, they're all creating. So why are some creators pushed to the front of the algorithm and some left behind? We are yelling about things like internment, where we collect and imprison people we don't like. It's African-American men are not disproportionately in prison because they commit more crimes. They're in prison because they don't have the money to defend themselves. And they're in prison because they aren't educated and don't realize they've had substandard educations often. We put the Japanese in prison after World War II. We put Latinos and Muslims in prison between 2016, actually between 2001 and 2021. right after the World Trade Center bombing, or I'm sorry, right after 9/11. So that would be we have huge history of putting people away that we don't like or we're afraid of. And I will stop touching this because clearly I'm screwing it up. We also have a school to prison pipeline. And, you know, prisons often are placed in rural counties where there aren't many prospects for jobs. And somebody's got to be in those prisons to, in order to employ the people in rural counties. It's one of the big problems that we have with prisons is that often the people who are running the prison don't look anything like the people who are being imprisoned. We're also complaining about ongoing and long-term income inequality. We're to the point where we have people millionaires making money during a pandemic while ignoring how to keep children and seniors safe, or even worse, how to just keep people working, people that we call essential, but won't give them a raise or give them a living wage. So yeah, those are the things we're complaining about at this point. There's other things. So this is the other question I get. What do you people want? And it's always told to me as you people. Well, most people of color just want an acknowledgement of the past. We want to repair the injuries that have occurred, and we want to see an improvement in the future. So, but one of the things, and if you look at these pictures, you know, here we go. Once again, people of color doing the work of the nation, feeding the nation. Here, Japanese folks put in prisons in World War II. And this is something else, you know, by the New American Foundation. 2 in 5 Americans say that Islam is incompatible with US values. What are US values? US values are all of our values. It's not white middle class values, which is what a lot of people want to believe US values are. But we're all here. The country was built as a melting pot. It has been a melting pot. And so why is it that some values matter more than others? So other things that we want is, as a nation, to acknowledge a history of slavery. But, you know, when you see that happening in schools, it's been being called critical race theory, and therefore, which it is not. And therefore, parents are in teachers' faces screaming at them. A year ago, people couldn't believe how wonderful teachers were and how much work teachers went through and did when they realized that they had to homeschool their children during a pandemic. They were talking about giving them raises and how they all deserved raises. And within a year now, they're in their faces screaming at and trying to direct what teachers teach. Teachers are educated at the master's degree level. They know the curriculum, the pedagogy better than most parents. And I would venture to say that people who are in the classrooms or in the meetings screaming at parents are not educated enough to teach their child. We'd really like to see policies addressed that can lead to, or that can close the gaps in home ownership, gaps in education, gaps in intergenerational wealth, and an access to healthcare and service provision of healthcare. We'd love to see, you know, the country address policies that send some people to prison, you know, kind of unequal treatment in the court system. And we're seeing that right now. We see people who essentially should be charged with treason getting, you know, 3 months in prison. Yet there are African-American men to this day who are in prison on 5 and 10-year sentences for having a couple of joints in their hand, or a rock of crack that one prisoner told me was smaller than the size of his baby fingernail, and he was doing a 10-year sentence. So it kind of takes my breath away, the way that we treat people unequally. And critical race theory is an analysis of these problems. We use critical race theory to analyze and look at these problems. Because of critical race theory, we could look at sentencing disparities. For many years, we had a disparity in how cocaine, which is in its powder form, people who used cocaine were sentenced compared to people who used crack. So men using crack were given sometimes 10 times the sentence of somebody using powdered cocaine. Well, what's the difference? The difference is white people use powdered cocaine and Black people were using crack because it was cheap. So using critical race theory, we were able to tease apart those sentences and thinking about, and looking at the idea of an indeterminate sentencing or mandatory minimums and make a change to that law so that now those two crimes are looked at equally and the system is being righted. People are being released because of that. So my question is, are these things anti-white mania, or is this just asking for equal treatment under the law? Is looking at and asking for us to address the continuing brutality and disparities in how laws are enforced, is that anti-white mania? Or is it just asking for respect and acknowledgement of the shared humanity that we all experience and we all have here in this country? So I just would like to end with this idea about what you can do. Oh my goodness, time is really passing. You can educate yourself on the lives of people who are different from you. I think that's a huge thing. There are lots of ways to start. And I have found some things kind of that took my breath away when I read about it or watched these movies. I love movies. And I think movies are a great way to learn things. The American Experience has a movie called The Eugenics Crusade. And in this movie, you begin to see how we begin to separate people out in our society and how easily that happens. There's another movie called An Uncomfortable Truth, and I was just watching a movie that kind of took my breath away about lynching postcards. It's like a 15-minute movie, and it talks about the way postcards were used and how the idea of lynching was memorialized in the US. You can also question policy and planning that's built around certain social systems like schools and education that limit who succeeds or sets other people up to succeed and then leaves a whole group of people out. You can think differently about systems where there are barriers to equal education or economic systems or access to job or health. And insist on education that includes an accurate portrayal of history and that acknowledges the pain and looks to improve the past. So this is the article, and I'll make sure that you guys get a copy of the PowerPoint. Marcy has a copy of that, so you can get access to some of the links. And this I'll let you read on your time. It essentially was from the article in the Washington Post that talked about, children and learning about slavery in the classroom. And this writer talks about herself being a descendant of North Carolina slave owners and how she has an opinion that reparations aren't about slavery. They're about, she said the Civil War was about slavery. And we as a nation paid in full. She said, listen up, reparations are due because of the 130 years of Jim Crow and the terror inflicted on Black people by institutions in society after the Civil War. And she talks about this in a very poignant way. Your uncle who is alive today suffered because he couldn't get benefits through the GI Bill. Your aunt and your grandmother who are alive today were denied college. Wealth and ownership were denied to them and their descendants. And she talks about that. She talks about her dad being a poor white man who was a World War II naval officer, got a college education, owned a home in a nice suburb due to the GI Bill, and how she benefited personally. And that a Black man his age couldn't do it. So his daughter, who's her age, is very far behind her. And that's why she sees reparations as necessary. I'm not sure that that's the solution I would look for. I see that as one of many solutions. But I do love that she just laid it out there in black and white, what the losses have been for people of color in the country. Here are other things you can do: reading books, watching The 13th, talking to people from different walks of life, talking with teachers, and then continuing to explore your own ideas and preconceived notions. What are the perspectives that were left out of what you were taught, and why, and who benefited from leaving out those parts of the story for you? And then finally, here are the resources that that I will stop my share. These are the resources that are available. So anyway, thank you very much for listening to me. I went on a bit long, and therefore I'll be on a little bit longer, so we can definitely get to questions.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Mhm.
And I am confident in my analysis that you are one of the smartest people I know. So, and I did put a little note in chat. If you either need a copy of the recording or the copy of the slides and you're not on the Magnolia UCC mailing list, just drop me an email at marcy@magnoliaucc.org, and I'm happy to get those to you. I've gotten private emails from a couple people who want this session to share with their congregations. I'm happy to do that. So just send me an email and I will get those to you, okay? Questions for Cheryl. So Lindsay has one. Just a comment: find your roots on Tuesday nights has been a huge part of my education. Dr. Lewis Gates Jr. is a national treasure.
They call him
Any-
Skip. They call him
Roger.
Skip in academia. We refer to him as Skip.
Skip.
So
Other
question.
questions?
Any comments?
Questions or comments? And please remember, you have to unmute yourself, and you can either put it in the chat or unmute yourself.
This is Chris KT.
Hey, Chris.
What I noticed about myself 5 years ago is I saw a text message or a message in Facebook between a Japanese brother and a Japanese woman that I grew up with, went to high school with. They were talking about what their aunt had learned, something about something in the internment camp. And I'm 70, in my 70s. I was absolutely flabbergasted at that moment. All these years later, it hit me that every Japanese person that I grew up with, their relatives were all in the internment camps. And when I was in high school, it didn't dawn on me. It was never brought up. I mean, it was never talked about. And then I reached out to a friend, to that woman. And she talked to me for 2 hours about her father's experiences in the Army. He went to Mississippi. His commanding officer said, "Fellas, stay here until I get the lay of the land." When he came back, he said, "Well, you're considered white, so you're free here." That was during World War II. Then I called a Hispanic gal I was in high school with, was flabbergasted to find out all the horrible things. She's a 7th generation Californian. All the things that she had experienced, and still to this day, when she walks in a room, looks around to see if she's the only one. So it's been a real growth, makes me cry. It's been a real growth experience for me. And I thought I was pretty knowledgeable. And I grew up in a place where there were lots of Hispanic people lots of Los Angeles, the greater Los Angeles area. So I was totally unaware of a lot of this stuff.
Thank you so much for acknowledging that. I appreciate it. And I think that if we think back to our youth, to our childhoods, the things that didn't get said, I have to say, I went to a religious boarding school for high school, and I skipped my junior year, but I did take a quarter of history, and I never knew about the Holocaust. No one ever talked about it. They talked about World War II, but I didn't even know the word until I was 20. I think I was 31. No, I was 31. I actually went to live with a Jewish family. And I was a nurse nanny in their home. And I had read voraciously. Actually, it may have happened a couple of years before that. In fact, it did. I was probably 28, where some of my friends were Jewish, and they would talk about how their mother had been in the camps, and I didn't know what they were talking about. And at that point, I started to read about the Holocaust. And I think I read for close to 3 years straight about it. And so when I went to live in this home with my Jewish friends and care for their little boy, I at least had an awareness of that story and of that history. I mean, there's so much that we miss here in the US. And I'm somewhat younger than some people here, but not much. And I mean, I remember the night that Dr. King was shot. I was 8 that year. And I just think about, the stories that we missed and the half stories that we were told, and even my parents, the stories that, the information they didn't give us. So and I know a lot of it was out of fear, a lot of it was the fear that they grew up with. So I think that this is a legacy of our country, and we will not move forward until we speak up and we begin to be honest about what our history was.
Okay, and thank you to Lois, who put in a link to Common Power. And on that history note, we had a great discernment session yesterday at Magnolia about kind of next steps on our own anti-racism work. And one of the things that came up was this lack of knowledge about really critical historical events. And so one of the things that we were considering is doing a learning forum around historical events that just weren't taught when many of us went to school, like the Tulsa Massacre, like the Trail of Tears, like the Japanese internment that Chris referenced. So keep your ears open. That might be something that we can pull off in the coming year. Okay, I want to be cognizant of Dr. Cook's time, so I would like to just kind of stop and recognize her and thank her for the gift of her wisdom and her insights and her ideas and her thoughts. So thank you to Cheryl for coming and doing this tonight.
My pleasure.
And I'll just let you know that our next forum in March is going to be on March 21st, and it is on food insecurity and hunger in our communities. And Jen Musa, who is the executive director of the Ballard Food Bank, is going to be talking about some of the systemic issues leading to hunger in our communities and some of the potential solutions to hunger in our communities. So stay tuned for that. Again, if you're not on our mailing list, you want that invitation, I will send it out through the conference, but just send me an email and I'll make sure you get the Zoom link for that. Before I let Dr. Cook go and let you all go, any final questions, comments, reactions for tonight?
One thing I want to say is, I will definitely make space for you to speak. One thing I want to say is Lois has behind her Protect Our Vote. That is one of the things that's happening right now in this country as another way to prevent people of color from feeling as if they are full citizens. This is still a reaction to the 13th Amendment, you know? And so if people can, you know, get some knowledge about those kinds of things, it's really important. You can see how once people of color were able to speak up and say, this is where our lives were. We have a voice here. We want to say something. Immediately, there was this backlash to quiet us again. And I don't think that we have a viable union if we keep going in this direction. Someone was going to say something, I cut them off.
Oh, it's me, it's Bev. And I just want to thank you for being here this evening and sharing all this information and knowledge. And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
If you can't get good history in your schools, if there's a university nearby, sometimes they have textbooks like from Canada that are a little more candid. It's worth a try.
Elizabeth, I love that you said that you read the Canadian textbook to get the information. And it's really interesting. Next country over gives a whole history of what went on here, you know, a much clearer history. It says something when we can't even tell our own stories.
And when we never know that we invaded Canada.
Or Mexico.
Yep.
Stole land from Mexico as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So really important things. It's not to make you ashamed of your country. It's to make you aware of our problems. And so we cannot repeat them again, or we can stop ourselves before we get out of control again, you know?
Yeah.
And
This
why
is
some
all
of our neighbors don't trust us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's America has some really, the US has some amazing people and amazing, wonderful ways and wonderful things that we've done for the world. But we also have some troubles that we need to come to terms with. And I think that we'll be a much better place when we have that candid conversation about who we are. It is also a part of, remember I talked about intersectionality? That's part of us too. That's a part of all of us. That's a part of all of our stories. So really important. Anyway, thank you all so much. I really appreciated your attention this evening. It's been a delight to be here.
Thank you, Cheryl. Always a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Have a good night. We were glad you were here.
Good
Thank
night.
you.